together, and so it is. This morning, we are on the third chapter of the Introduction to the Science of Mind textbook, and as I stated last week, these 4 chapters are Ernest Holmes' restatement of Thomas Troward's book, The Creative Process in the Individual. So we started with the idea that there's a creative process in the universe. There's a creation, so there's a process by which creation comes about. And no one is entirely sure what that is. As Dr. Holmes says, we in religion wish to walk hand in hand with science from the visible to the invisible, back to that singularity, to that oneness, to that starting point. In physics, it is before the Big Bang. In religion, it is the essence of the divine. And it's ineffable. Ineffable means we can't find words to describe it. It is beyond words. As the Upanishads tell us, it is that which is beyond words, but from which words come. It is that which is beyond thought, but from which thought comes. And this is an important point, because we're not going to grasp God with our intellect. God is beyond the intellect, before the intellect is a better way of saying it. So no amount of logic and reason will let us experience the divine. Logic and reason will tell us that there's something there. Logic and reason will tell us that there are many people throughout history who have told us that they have kissed the divine, if you will. They have had the experience, the mystical experience. Paul was knocked off his horse and blinded by the light. Moses experienced the presence as a fire that did not consume, a burning meditation, you see. All religious movements, all religions start when somebody has an experience. Joseph Smith had an experience and founded the Mormon religion. Allah had an experience in the cave, founded and Islam came from that. Jesus experienced that he and the Father were one, and then told us that we were one as well. So we through study, through reading, through intellect, we can come to at least acknowledge, well, yeah, some people have had this experience. Some people have had an experience that they say is an experience of something so magnificent that they can't describe it. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, but is that experience for us? Can we have that experience as well? And as I mentioned over and over again, if you look at the way that the scripture that we use here in the West, if we start out with what we call the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, we start at a period where human consciousness knows its connection to the divine, in the Garden of Eden, and this is a metaphor in the story. But we desire to know. Our knowledge, our intellect wanted to know the knowledge of good and the knowledge of evil. So our curiosity kind of took us away, if you want to think of it in that light, but we could never be away from that which is everywhere present. But in consciousness, in the intellect, we have this separation. So it is the intellect that has separated us, if you wish to think of it that way. It has separated us from the experience of the divine. But it's not necessarily a bad separation. I love the quote that Wendy gave us to start. It's can we accept the fact that we are not perfect? But that's okay, because we're not supposed to be perfect. We are supposed to be growing. We are supposed to be learning. And in this process of growing and learning, we make mistakes. Or we do things we wish we hadn't done. We do things with hindsight that we go, what was I thinking when I did that? But that's okay. It's part of the process of growing. Back in the 60s, Dr. Maxwell Maltz, who was a plastic surgeon, he became aware of the fact that what people believed was actually more important than what physically was. that he would have people who would come to him who looked perfectly normal, and they would insist that they were deformed and they wanted some type of a plastic surgery. And then he had other people who were in fact deformed in some way, and they thought they were just fine the way they were, and they didn't want plastic surgery. And he started to explore that. He wrote a book called, I think it's Psycho-Cybernetics. It was very popular when I was a kid in high school. And he said, he was talking about the learning process and how we kind of evolve our self-image, self-image psychology, I think is what he called it. And he likened it to like a missile going to the moon, a rocket ship going to the moon. And it doesn't stay straight on course. It's kind of not possible to do that. But it drifts a little bit, and it checks where it is, and it says, oh, I'm off course a little bit. I need to turn back the other way. And it turns a little bit, and it goes, and it passes through the line of the course that it should be on, and it goes, and it's off course the other way, and then it checks, and says, oh, I'm off course again. And it goes back the other way. And he says, if you look at the path is a series of zigzags, but over time, the drifting away from the course gets shallower and shallower. So we start out, we make big mistakes, and then we learn from those mistakes, and then we make littler mistakes, and we just kind of evolve, we just kind of grow. So I think what we have to understand from that is that we are all a work in progress. We are all evolving spiritually. We are all trying to figure this out. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? And it's okay. It's okay not to have it all. It's okay not to know it all. It's okay not to be it all, because we are here to grow. And in that growing, in that growing and in that learning, we develop our own uniqueness. We are each unique. We are each an individualized expression of the divine. The divine could not have created us fully aware of who and what we are, or we just would have been like Dr. Holmes says, automatons is what he called them, little robots. We needed to start from a place of less than complete awareness, and then work our way back home. In the mystical teaching of the Kabbalah, we were listening to a series of tapes from a rabbi. I think they were made like in the late 60s, early 70s. And I love the teaching. And again, this is a metaphor. We're going to talk about stories a little bit here. This is a metaphor. This is not to be taken literally. But the idea is that the divine has everything. It is everything. It knows everything. Everything that there is to be known, it knows. Except, and this is the big caveat, it cannot know anything unlike itself. This is important because people will say, well, does God know I'm suffering? No, God cannot know suffering. If God could know suffering, God would be suffering. So God cannot know suffering. So the way to think of this is, if you and I were standing on the surface of the sun, if we could do that without burning up, and we were looking down at planet Earth, we would see the side of planet Earth that is facing the sun. But we couldn't see the dark side. We couldn't see where it was night. It's invisible to us. We don't know what's going on there because we can't see what's going on there. So the simple way of explaining it is the divine doesn't know these things that we complain about. These are experiences we have because temporarily we have blocked off the light. That's it. We have temporarily blocked off the light. Again, I'll go back to, if I go in the room and I pull all the curtains tight so the sunshine can't get in, the sun isn't bothered by that at all. The sun doesn't know I'm sitting here in the dark, As soon as I open the curtains, the light comes into the room. So in this teaching of the Kabbalah, the divine having all that there is, what does it do? This is what we're talking about today, what it does. What does the divine do, You have everything there is to have and know everything there is to know. Don't need anything, already have everything. Then what is it possible for it to do? And in this teaching, it was the divine wanted to give of itself, because itself is the only thing that it has to create. It's the only thing it has to give is itself. Itself is everything. So The first act of creation then was to create a vessel. Think of it as like a jug, a stone, a masonware jug. A vessel that it could give of itself into the vessel. That vessel is the soul. It's you and I. But the souls were in such close proximity to the divine that they were always full. So the soul said, well, we need to find a way to empty ourselves out so that the divine can give, right? So the soul is cooperating in the desire of the divine to give of itself. The soul is cooperating by emptying itself out and then receiving. Again, this is a teaching from mystical Judaism that we studied some years ago. But what happened was the souls were in such close proximity to the divine that as fast as they tried to empty themselves out, they were refilled. And they went into a frenzy of trying to empty themselves out, and they got into such a frenzy that they cracked. Right? Now again, this is a teaching story. This is a teaching story, but they cracked. So the first act of creation didn't work out so well, if you won't believe that. The first act of creation resulted in these little cracked jugs, these souls that could not possibly empty themselves out fast enough. So what the souls did was they said, you know what, we need to temporarily withdraw from the immediate presence of the divine. We need to go into this time-space experience that you and I have on earth. We need to go into this appearance of separation, and then we can empty ourselves out and not be refilled so quickly that we'll crack. And this is in that teaching, this is how we wind up here on planet Earth. And this is why we are not completely aware of the magnificence of what we are, because we are a part of the divine. It has created us out of itself. Right? Now you can take that teaching, you can go to different teachings around the world, and this is what theologians call the problem of evil, which is, if God is so good, why aren't we all perfect? Why are we courageous enough, as Wendy said, why are we courageous enough to be imperfect? And it is because we recognize then that we are in the process of evolving. We are in the process of receiving. We are in the process of growing. In the Eastern traditions, the fall is not the fall of Adam and Eve, who were kicked out of the garden because of sin. Right? The fall is the fall or the descent of consciousness into the form of matter. And as consciousness descends from spirit into matter to animate matter, right, it cloaks itself with ignorance. It can't possibly arrive in the material form fully aware and fully enlightened. So in that teaching, then there is a fall of sorts, but it is not a punishment. Right? It is a natural consequence of spirit's desire to express itself as us, cloaked in material form. And we are slowly figuring it out. We are slowly working our way back home. I love Ram Dass, what he said. He said, we're all just walking each other home. That's all we're doing. We're all just walking each other home. So we want to keep this in mind then, that there is a creative process in the universe. The divine speaks its word and says, let it be, and there is, to put it in very simple terms. And then how does that process work? How does that process work? So we say, well, there's a part of the divine that acts as a blind force, as a law, such as a law of gravity. And spirit has its intention to experience life in some particular way. And this part of the divine itself that operates as the creative force makes it so. So I get the image of Patrick Stewart on the bridge of the Enterprise in one of the more recent Star Trek series. He puts out his finger and he says, make it so, number one, make it so. The divine says, let it be, make it so. And something acts upon that and makes it so. And because we are created out of it, that same process is at work in our lives at all times, not just when we decide to deliberately use it, but at all times. Okay, so that's kind of the setup into where we're going this morning. And I want to talk about the power of stories, the power of imagery. There's a gentleman named Vernon Howard, and I believe he was a Unity minister down in Atlanta some years ago. And he wrote a remarkable little book. I'm going to give you the title. If you need to get it, go back after I post this video on YouTube again. Go back and you can play it to get the title. The title of the book is Psychopictography. Psychopictography by Vernon Howard, and the whole book is about the power of the image, the power of the story. This is why ancient teachers taught in parables. People didn't read, people didn't write, people may not remember everything that was said, but they would take the story, and the story had to be something that they could relate to, but they would take the story away with them. And I love it. I'm going to give it to you. I know I've given it to you before, but I'm going to give it to you again because I find it so powerful. The opening story in the book, and I have to tell you, the book is just page after page after page after page of little teaching stories. And there's kind of an index to it that says if you want to have more health in your life, read these stories. If you want to have more prosperity in your life, read these stories. So you can kind of use it as an index. But the opening story that he gives us is this little boy in Europe who's just a preschooler. And this is, hundreds of years ago when people drove around in wagons. And he wandered a little bit too far from his home, and he was picked up by a traveling group. The groups that used to travel around and just go from place to place and do different things. And they picked this boy up and they took him as their own, and they were using him kind of to work. They made kind of a slave laborer out of him. They carried him away from his home, and wherever they would go and set up and do whatever it was that they did, they would make him work. And he was very little when this happened, and he didn't know the name of the town that he grew up in. He didn't remember much of anything. But he knew that being with these people, that was not his permanent home. And he always wanted to return home, but he never knew how to get there. So one day when he was about 17, he was able to sneak away from these people who had kidnapped him. And he just started wandering. He just started wandering all over Europe. And the only thing that he could remember about his hometown was the sound of the church bell. So he would go to every town that he could find. He would follow the roads and he would wander from town to town to town, and he would listen to the bell. And he would hear the bell ring and he would say, that's not it, that's not it. And he would continue his journey. He would continue wandering. And then one day he was coming up a hill. And as he was getting up towards the top of the hill, he heard a bell start to ring. And his heart leapt. He thought it was the bell that he recognized from his childhood. And his pace quickened and he ran up to the top of the hill. And when he got there out of breath, he looked down into the valley and he could hear the church bell ringing. And he recognized the town. He was back home. He was back home. And Vernon Howard gives us this story to help us remember that we are all just walking each other back home. We have come from love to love we return. We have had ignorance heaped upon us, if you want to think of it in the Hindu terms. We have left the garden, if you want to think of it in the terms that we've come to learn in the West here. We have deliberately entered into the time-space existence so that Spirit could enjoy filling us up. However you want to think of it, we are in this experience, but we know it is not the ultimate experience. We know it is a temporary experience. We know we are here for purpose, and we know we are working. And there's something within us that guides us on our way. Just like the sound of the bell guided that little boy, there's something within us that guides us on our way, and we have to trust it. The power of the story. Dr. Holmes tells us that out in Colorado, there is a valley that is full of surface springs. I've never been there. I lived in Colorado for a while, but I don't know exactly where he's talking about. But he says if you go through this valley, you will see many different places where the water just bubbles up out of the ground. And each spring has different characteristics. Some squirt very high up in the air, some just kind of ooze out of the ground, some are very wide, some are the stream of water, some are very thin. Each one is different. And he says what powers those springs is that high up in the mountain there's a lake, there's a reservoir up there, and it's full of water, and an inexhaustible supply of water as far as the springs are concerned. Excuse me. And that water makes its way down through little cracks in the rocks, makes its way all the way down from the higher altitudes until it gets to this valley. And there in the valley, the water finds an outlet. The pressure of the water finds an outlet to bubble up, to squirt up. Now the water itself will take any form. It doesn't care. It will take any form. It will squirt high, it'll squirt low, it'll be fat, it'll be skinny. It will take any form. It does not matter to the water what form it takes. But what determines what form it takes is the channel that each spring provides for it. You and I are the spring. The eternal, the divine, the creative force of the universe, the presence of the divine, right? That is the self-givingness of spirit. And it is ready, willing, and able to give of itself to us and through us, but it can only do so according to the channel that you and I provide for it. Now, you and I can do something that the springs in the valley in Colorado cannot do. We can increase the size of the opening. We can deliberately change that, because in the spiritual world, that channel is a channel in consciousness, an avenue in consciousness, Dr. Holmes tells us. The purpose of spiritual mind treatment, the practice of scientific prayer, is to create the avenue within our consciousness through which that which already exists can be given. Another story. When I was a kid, there was a gentleman on TV called Mr. Wizard. I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember Mr. Wizard. I think Don Herbert was his real name, and he was a science teacher at a school somewhere. And he had just had a little segment on TV where he would come out and he would do different scientific experiments, mostly geared towards, grade school kids. The kind of things that really their purpose was just simply to wow us into wanting to know more about science, and he was very good at what he did. He was a very good teacher. So this one experiment he gave, and he always would set these things up like, if you bet your friend this, what do you think they would do? It reminded me of the back of the comic books where they sold all these magic tricks, and it was always amaze and mystify your friends, and just send us, a quarter, and we'll send you this magic trick, and those kind of things. But Mr. Wizard took a glass of water, just clear water, and he says, if you told your friend that you could stick your finger in that water without getting wet, what do you think your friend would say? And of course, all the kids, he had little kids on the set, they would say, well, our friend would say that was not possible. He says, well, if you bet them $1 that you could do it, do you think that they would bet you $1? And he said, oh yeah, absolutely. He says, well, get ready to collect your dollars, because I'm going to show you how to do this. So he just reached and he grabbed a little jar of talcum powder, a little tin of talcum powder, and he sprinkled talcum powder on top of the water in the glass, just a thin layer, maybe 1/8 of an inch or so. And then he had one of the kids stick their finger into the glass of water. And what happened is as their finger went down through the talcum powder provided a very thin layer on their skin that kept the skin from getting wet. So here they had their finger down inside the glass of water, but the finger stayed dry because the talcum powder provided a barrier. All this water is in the glass. The water is more than willing to wet your finger or wet the kid's finger, but there was something in the way. There was something preventing it, you see. The perfection of God is already here. It is already where we are. All of the wisdom, all of the power, all of the love is already here. But there's something in the way. See, there's something in the way. It is all of the things that we believe to be true that are not true, all of our false ideas, and all of the things that we have not yet opened ourselves up to realizing, up to experiencing, up to believing. Our spiritual growth is to dissolve that barrier of talcum powder, to get rid of it, to get rid of the things within us, within our consciousness, that are preventing us from experiencing all of the goodness that is here. Another story. I had a friend back in the 60s, one of my friend's fathers, he worked as a maintenance man in the public housing buildings in New York City. And these were buildings where a lot of times immigrants coming to the U.S., they would come here, and that's where they would get their start. People who did not speak English, people who came from totally different backgrounds and different cultures. This is where they would come, and they would find a place to live until they could get on their feet and get acclimated to the culture and go out and find work and all those kind of things. And this was in the 60s. We were bringing in a lot of people from tropical climates. We were bringing in people from Vietnam and Asia and all over the place. We had people coming in who did not live in the same environment that we lived in. I remember one time we were on a job in North Carolina, and one of the technicians, or a computer technician that they flew in from the Caribbean, because he was an expert in this system that we were installing. And we were working in a little telephone office out in a little nowhere in North Carolina. And when it came to break, we had to get in the car and go down to the service station, to the gas station in town. In those days, a service station was a gathering place, and we go in and get a bottle of soda and a pack of crackers and things like that. And he went in with us, and we went back, and he said, what was that big metal box in the middle of the room? And we were scratching our head and trying to think, big metal box in the middle of the room. So tell us more about it. He says, what is this big metal box? It was just in the middle of the room. He says, there was something wrong with it. He says it was getting hotter and hotter. The longer I stood there, I had to move away from it. Well, it was an oil circulating heater. If you've ever seen these, and been in a big building like that, it is just exactly that. It's a metal box with a flue pipe, and oil drips in it into a little pan, and the oil burns and makes heat. He had never seen one. See, where he grew up, he didn't need heat. He was an intelligent man. He was a computer scientist. He had never seen it. He had just never experienced it. See? So my friend's father was telling us one day that he went on to a service call, and he went up to an apartment to repair something in the apartment. And while he was there, he noticed that in the bathtub, the people had all of their perishable groceries in the bathtub surrounded by ice. And this was like a 5 stories up in the building. They're carrying this ice up there, and he thinks, well, there must be something wrong with the refrigerator. Let me go look at the refrigerator and see what I need to do to get the refrigerator fixed while I'm here. So he went over to the refrigerator, and he opened the doors of the refrigerator, and they had folded laundry in the refrigerator. They were using it as a closet. And of course, he did not speak whatever language they spoke. They didn't speak what language he spoke. And he had to eventually get a translator to help, because he wanted to help these people. He wanted to find out what was wrong with the refrigerator, why they weren't using it. And it came to find out there was nothing wrong with the refrigerator. Wherever these people were from, they didn't have refrigeration. They didn't know what refrigeration was. They were using the bathtub as a place to keep their perishable groceries cold because they didn't understand that the refrigerator would do that for them. They were not stupid people. They just had never experienced that. They had not opened themselves up to that possibility. So through the translator, he was able to explain to them that the refrigerator was not a clothes closet. It was a place to keep the perishable groceries cold. So they turned the refrigerator on. They got the refrigerator running. They moved the groceries, the produce and everything from the bathtub into the refrigerator. And the people were very happy. They didn't have to carry the ice up any longer. The principle of refrigeration was ready, willing, and able to do something useful for these folks, right? To keep their food from going bad, but they were not yet attuned to it. They had not yet opened to that possibility. So because they had not yet been able to open up to that, they were still doing things in the old way, which you and I would say, well, that's a difficult way to do it, carrying ice up the stairs. Now, when I was a kid, they still did that. My grandparents still had an ice box, where the guy would come with a block of ice and they would put it into the ice box. And it had a little electric fan that kind of moved air around the block of ice up into a box that kept the food not cold, but it kept it from going bad. The creative process of the universe is ready, willing, and able to do for us what needs to be done, what we want to do. But we have to learn how to use it. We have to learn how to work with it. All right. Another story. Maybe I'm just going to tell stories today. I don't know. Another story. When I was a kid, we could go to the hardware store in town and we could buy lead. Now I realize today it's probably toxic and you can't do that. But when I was a kid, you could go to the hardware store and they had big chunks of lead. And you would take that up to the counter and they would put it on a scale and weigh it. And I don't remember how much it was a pound, a nickel a pound or something. And we would take this little brown paper bag full of lead home with us. And there we had a melting pot on a little burner that ran off of a small cylinder of propane gas, little kind of propane tanks that you hold in your hand. So we would hook this thing up and we would light the fire. And this, I don't know what the pot was made of. It might have been cast iron. I don't know. It was something that didn't melt at the same temperature as lead. But what we would do is we would take a hammer and break the lead up into small pieces and drop small pieces of lead into this pot. And over time, with the heat from the torch, from the propane, the lead would start to melt. It would become liquid. It would turn from solid to liquid. Excuse me, let me get a drink of water here. Now, when the lead had become liquid, we had molds. We had a series of molds. It was a piece of metal and it kind of flipped open, and then you close it and there was holes in the top. And we would stand that up, and we would very carefully, the pot that you melted the lead in had kind of a little dip in, a little lip to pour it out. And we would be able to pick that up. I can't remember what we used so we didn't get burned, but we would pick that up and we would very carefully pour that molten lead into the molds. And what the molds were they were fishing sinkers. We lived on the water and we fished a lot. And when you fish a lot, you lose a lot of lead weights, right? You had to put a piece of lead on the line to keep it to the bottom, but if the line broke, you lost your lead. So this is how we got our fishing sinkers. I mean, today you would go down to the store and just buy them pre-made, but we made them as kids. The lead did not care what size mold it was being poured in. Some molds were very, very tiny, and they made sinkers that might weigh only a half an ounce, and some were very, very big, and they might make sinkers that weighed 2 or 3 ounces. If you were fishing in an area where the current was very strong, you needed to put a lot of lead on there to keep the weight, to keep your hook down on the bottom. The point is the lead didn't care, see? The lead didn't care. Now, the lead created the fishing sinker by becoming the fishing sinker. It was just lead taking the form of the fishing sinker. So what we want to keep in mind for today, we're going to, as I said, these 4 chapters overlap. We're going to pick up some more next week. But I wanted to leave these stories. I want to give these stories out there and kind of bring it together this way. We are surrounded by infinite intelligence. We are surrounded by omnipotence, unlimited power. We are surrounded by the omnipresence. We are surrounded by the presence that is all presence. We are all part of it. It is expressing itself as us, but it can only do so to the degree that we accept, that we cooperate, that we learn, that we grow, that we understand, see? So just like having a refrigerator and not knowing how to use it, we have access to the unlimited wisdom of the universe, but we don't know how to use it, or we haven't applied ourselves to it. So you see the commercial on TV where the guy goes in the gym and spreads out his mat and does one push-up, and then he goes away and he says, "There, I got that done." Well, you know that exercise doesn't work that way, right? Last year, before the pandemic hit, I was going to a physical therapist who helped me with my back and did a great job. And she worked in a CrossFit gym. And I don't know if you know what that is, but if you've seen like Ninja Warrior on TV, these are amateur athletes who do all kinds of incredible things with their bodies. They can climb ropes, and they can swing from thing to thing and jump from thing to thing. And it's just incredible to watch what they do with their bodies. Ordinary people like you and I. But the difference is that they apply themselves. You know, so I used to joke, I would go in the gym and I would walk past all these people who had muscles upon muscles upon muscles, and I would say, well, there, but for the grace of God go I. See, I could do that. My body would do that. The difference between their body and my body was not the way the body was made. The difference is what they did with it. They applied themselves to it. These folks would show up at that gym at 5:30 every morning, 6 days a week. And they would work out for at least an hour or more. Different workouts all the time, working different muscles of their body all the time. And then they would go shower and go to work. And occasionally they get together and they have a competition where they kind of do a certain set of exercises against the clock. But these people are in incredible shape because they apply themselves. So sometimes what happens is we start thinking about, we live in a spiritual universe. We live surrounded by omniscience. We live surrounded by omnipotence. It is expressing itself in us, as us, and through us, but only to the degree that we have provided that channel. And the way for us to experience more of it is to increase the size of that channel, or in the example of putting the finger through the talcum powder, is remove the barriers, remove the blocks, remove the obstacles that prevent it from doing what it does, which is it creates through us, to the degree of our receptivity, and it creates by becoming the thing that has been created. So our spiritual growth, this is January, and we start off every year by reflecting upon the essential elements of what we believe and kind of setting our spiritual goals for the year, you know, much like New Year's resolutions in our lives. Where do you want to be a year from now? When we get together a year from now, we sit and we have this conversation, where do you want to be a year from now? How much do you want to have grown in your personal knowledge and your personal experience. Remember, I said it's not an intellectual thing, but you have to experience it. And the only way you can experience it is by creating a greater avenue in your consciousness, by removing the barriers in your consciousness to experience the divinity that is already there. Excuse me. In a year from now, how much do you want to have grown in that direction? See? And then what are you willing to do? What are you willing to commit to do, to get there? The CrossFit athletes make a big commitment. They work out every day. They work with coaches who help them, who teach them. They encourage each other along. They share information. They just don't go to the gym and do one push-up and then go home and think they've got it done. So I'm inviting us today. I love that Wendy just spontaneously picked that opening quote. I invite us today to recognize and to embrace the fact that we are not yet perfect. We are perfect in our imperfection, or as Raymond Charles Barker said, you and I can do something God can't do. We can use intelligence in an unintelligent manner. We can produce all kinds of crazy stuff in our lives. But this year, if we recognize then that, gee, if I wanted to be a competitive athlete, I know what to do. I just need to do it. And then we can say, well, gee, if I want to have a greater experience of God, I know what to do. I just have to do it. So look at how many spiritual push-ups you've been doing in your life. You know, you get up in the morning and have 10 or 15 minutes or 5 minutes. You know, think of all of the things that you've ever done in your life, and if you gave them the amount of time and attention that you give your spiritual growth, where do you think you would be? You know, if you wanted to learn a new language and you gave it a few minutes in the morning and a few minutes in the evening, it would take a very long time to learn that language. If you wanted to be a competitive athlete and you worked out for 5 minutes in the morning and 10 minutes in the evening, you know, where would you be? So I want you to think of this as spiritual muscle that we're building. I'm not picking on anybody. I'm not saying anybody's not doing enough. I'm just saying whatever we're doing, we can do more. See? Because we're going to be doing more forever and ever and ever and ever. We are constantly going to be learning more of what God is. So where do you want to be a year from now? What are you willing to do to get there? Are you willing to commit yourself? Are you willing to create that greater avenue through which the divine can give of itself? Because that's its only desire, to give, to express, to experience, to enjoy life in some unique way as you and I. Are we allowing God to have as much fun as it could have through us and as us? And I think the answer to that is always going to be, well, no, we can always have more. We can always allow more. So let this be the year that we do that. Next week we're going to pick up a little bit more with some ideas of what it does, but we're going to go into the how to use it, the last chapter of the introduction. Have a beautiful week. Enjoy. It's a beautiful day here where we are in South Carolina. The folks at the coast said it was a beautiful day. It's a beautiful day. Enjoy, but take time to enjoy the miracle that you are. You know, I love the line from St. Paul. He says, who am I that God is mindful of me? Who am I that thou art mindful of me? The very love of God, the very presence of God has decided to suit up and show up dressed as you. Isn't that something to celebrate? Isn't that a miracle to celebrate? So let's dedicate ourselves to giving it the best experience we can allow it to have as us, by every day catching God being God